My name is Cynthia Mascarenas, and I was a wife and a mother for 29 years and 5 weeks. Today, I'm still a mother, but now I get to be known as a widow. One night in February of 2018, my world as I knew it had come to an end. My husband, who was healthy and young, died of a heart attack in the middle of the night. The weeks, the days, the months, the years, they all began to run into each other after that, because it was just a series of grief experiences which required me to adapt to a new identity that I had not yet begun to embrace. Not too long after my husband passed away, I had to come to terms with the words death, death certificate, funeral. In fact, I had to get used to those in about the first 24 hours after he passed away. I remember being asked, do you need help with the funeral arrangements, or do you have a place to have the funeral? And I just looked at the person and I said, whose funeral? This is the state of shock that you could find yourself in when you lose a spouse suddenly. I fast forward through the next several months and realized in those months that I was all alone. After the first 2 weeks, in some cases, maybe some folks lingered around for 2 months. Very few people stayed the course with me because it was not a familiar, comfortable, or easy course to be on. I was not much fun to be around, and I really had regressed to a helpless condition. I remember not going to church for the longest time for multiple reasons. One is because it was hard to relive those memories and sit in the pew all by myself where I once sat with my husband. But for another reason, because the church I was with for 7 or 8 years, and I was also in a small group, and so I was known. I was not fairly known or well known, but it was a large church and I knew a good amount of people. They also all remember seeing me there with my husband the night before he passed away. I just heard from them the morning my husband passed away. The church sent somebody over who knew us well, and he greeted us, offered his condolences, and offered the church as a venue for a funeral service. That was the last time I heard from the church that I called my church. Over the next several months, I wandered into different churches just because a part of me wanted to be among people, but a part of me did not want to be known by any of those people. And I remember developing some kind of relationship with a few people in this church I visited, and I'm very grateful for their friendship and for their grace and understanding. However, one day I looked at the pastor and I said, Pastor, I don't think I'm going to make it. I don't know if I'm going to make it. And he just looked at me with all the love and caring that he could muster. And he was a good man. And he said, I don't know how to help you. That made me realize that the church had a problem, that either it had not identified or it recognized but did not know how to deal with. That started my journey in documenting my experience. In about 9 months after my husband passed away, I had written 2 books. One was just documenting my journey, the grief journey itself, the difficult, ugly moments in the middle of the night or during the day that make you feel like you're not going to survive this, the depths of darkness that you endure when you're in grief. And at the end of each of those experiences, as I wrote and as I chronicled, I reminded myself and forced myself to go to the promises of Scripture. Because even though I didn't feel them in the moment, I knew one thing, that the Scriptures do not lie. And I knew that God was the same yesterday, today, and forever. I couldn't feel His love. I couldn't experience His love. But that doesn't mean He is not present and He is not loving. I knew I was looking at God through the broken prism of grief. So I held on to God as I knew Him to be in the decades previously in my life, knowing that I had changed. He had not. The second book I wrote was a book which offered solutions to the problems that I faced on a daily basis, just practical solutions, things that I felt like if my church was here for me during this is how it would have helped. If only somebody was able to ask me how to help, this is what I would have said. And so that book became a guidebook for churches to help them in the experience of walking alongside a widow. The first book is Widows Are Warriors, a walk through the wilderness of widowhood, because that's truly what it is, a wilderness, always something unknown around the next corner, and always walking in fear. The second book is Walk with the Widow, a guidebook for churches. This book, with great detail, goes through a process that you can follow from the moment you receive a phone call saying somebody has passed away. And it gives you action steps from that stage on to maybe the first year or two. And then it also has recommendations on how to offer sustained support to widows who've been widows for a while, widows whose needs are quite different than the needs of a widow who's just lost a spouse. My experience has been that there are few, if any, there are very few churches who actually have a ministry to widows. And kudos to the churches that are doing something. Whatever you do is more than most churches do. However, churches are really the first place a grieving widow would turn to in order to find comfort, solace, strength, and just a sense of family. In the best scenario, a widow needs to find that right within the church that was and hopefully continues to be considered a part of her family. That is not very common, however, because the majority of widows, they stick around for a bit. They find out that most people avoid them, and eventually the widow feels like she is not welcome and she isolates herself. Why does the church behave in that manner? Who likes to be around a grieving person? Who's comfortable with someone who's just lost a loved one? Does anyone know what to say? Is there anything that really helps? These are questions that every individual asks. And the answer to them is there is nothing that fixes the widow. There is nothing that fixes her grief. And yet, just knowing she's not alone can be a huge part of her journey in healing. So what is my goal for the widow in launching this ministry that's called Walk with the Widow? My goal is that the church would be trained and taught on little things that they can do using the ministries that are already in their existence, but being intentional in how they use those ministries to help the widows in their church and their community. In so doing, a widow begins to feel like she has a body around her, that she has a family that surrounds her. She does not feel the need to go out and look for a church and to reconfigure her life and to try to figure out what her new identity is. She can embrace her new identity in time. Let's not create another new situation for her where she has to now find herself in a new church with a new pastor, new people, totally isolated from the people that she once called friends and family. I encourage you to go to our website, Triumphant and Treasured. I encourage you to look at what we do locally and globally. A lot of what we do locally is very different than what we do globally, because widows here have support despite the fact that they don't have enough, and despite the fact that 9 out of 10 times their church fails to support them. The widows in the US struggle with finding their family again. They should not have to go looking for a new place to belong if the place that they once belonged in wrapped their arms around them and embraced them and showed them the way in embracing their new identity at the old church. The widows who live in impoverished countries around the world, they have a very different story. Their story is more about survival. Their story is more about feeding themselves and their children. And we do what we can do to help facilitate their financial independence, to promote community, and to restore their dignity. We ask you to take a look at what it is we do. At the end of this video, we will offer you a link to go visit, and you can look at the work we do locally and globally. I thank you so much for listening to my story, and I invite you to be a part of the continued journey of Walk with the Widow and Triumphant and Treasured. I invite you to be the one that takes big steps in changing the lives of widows here in the United States and also around the world. God bless you.